Here is something that the headlines are not telling you. In the last 7 days, the Nigeria Democratic Congress has held a 3-hour emergency summit between its national leader and its presidential candidate. Its Kano chapter is in open rebellion. Its Lagos chapter is accusing the state chairman of rigging. A senior figure in the southeast is being sued for defamation, and its vice presidential candidate has reportedly threatened to walk out of the party entirely. And yet, through all of that, Professor Udenta, one of the NDC's most respected internal voices, sat in front of a camera and told Nigerians with absolute clarity, Peter Obi will be the next president of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Not maybe, not could be, will be. So the question this video is going to answer is not whether Peter Obi has the vision or the public appeal. We already know the answer to that. The question is this: can a party that is tearing itself apart from the inside actually put him in Aso Rock? Stay with me, because the answer is not as straightforward as either his supporters or his critics want you to believe. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Naija Insight Desk exists for one reason: to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now, because this conversation is about to get deeper. To understand why Udenta's statement matters, you need to understand the precise moment it was made in. Peter Obi arrived at the NDC's National Secretariat in Abuja on Tuesday, the 19th of May 2026, for a presidential screening exercise. He was the only aspirant who had purchased the presidential nomination forms before the deadline. The party had already zoned its presidential ticket to the south, a decision that was transparently designed to clear the path for Obi. He was screened, he was cleared, and on the 30th of May 2026, at the NDC Special Convention held at Le Finesse Event Center in Abuja, Peter Obi was formally nominated as the party's 2027 presidential flag bearer. In his acceptance speech, he told the hall a new Nigeria is possible. He pledged one term, and he named Rabiu Musa Kwankwaso as his running mate, completing a Peter Obi-Kwankwaso ticket that had been discussed, theorized, and anticipated for nearly 2 years. By any measure of political optics, this was a clean moment, a historic coalition, the Southeast and the Northwest on the same ticket, a former Labour Party candidate and a former NNPP heavyweight now sharing a platform. But here is what happened in the 9 days that followed. The NDC's nationwide primary elections held on the 29th of May 2026 produced immediate controversy. Results were not released for over 10 days. Allegations of manipulation began circulating across states. Lagos NDC officials held a press conference accusing their state chairman of rigging. In Abia State, the primary election committee chairman bypassed the National Secretariat and submitted results directly to INEC, something the party's constitution explicitly forbids. The NDC's National Publicity Secretary was clear on this, but the fact that someone in the party attempted it anyway reveals something important. There are people within the NDC who do not fully accept the supremacy of its national leadership, and in a party that is 3 months old, that is a dangerous early precedent. There's also the matter of the unresolved power-sharing arrangement. When Kwankwaso joined the NDC in early May 2026, Dickson reportedly brokered a structural deal in Kano. 60% of party positions and legislative tickets would go to Kwankwasia movement, 40% retained by the legacy NDC. That was the agreement. But after the primary exercise, NDC leaders in Kano alleged that Kwankwaso's loyalties took everything: governorship, Senate, House of Representatives, State Assembly, leaving original NDC members without a single nomination form. When you have a written agreement, even an informal one, that a vice presidential candidate reportedly chose to ignore, that is not a political squabble. That is a breach of trust at the structural level of the party. The NDC does not yet have the institutional history, the court of internal appeal, or the organizational depth to absorb this kind of dispute quietly. INEC's deadline for uploading candidate details is June 26th. That is not months away, that is days. Here is what none of the party's official statements have addressed. If the NDC cannot hold its internal candidates to an agreed structure in one state before an election campaign has even started, what happens in 36 states when the real political pressure arrives?
Let us now step back from the institutional detail and ask the strategic question. Who benefits from an NDC in crisis? The most obvious answer is the ruling APC. And that answer is probably correct, but it is more layered than it first appears. The political analyst Rufai Oseni made an observation in May 2026 that deserves to be taken seriously. He said the only opposition figure who poses a real electoral threat to President Bola Tinubu in 2027 is Peter Obi. He further said, and this is based on political mapping that major parties have conducted, that the primary strategy of those who want to protect Tinubu's incumbency is not to out-campaign Obi, but to keep Obi off the ballot entirely. And if he cannot be kept off the ballot through litigation, then the next strategy is to fragment the coalition around him before it has the chance to consolidate. This is not a conspiracy theory. Obi said it himself on the day he joined the NDC. He stood in the party secretariat and pleaded openly, "We have come to the NDC to help build a united Nigeria that works for everyone." The government created crisis after crisis in our party, forcing us to leave. We are pleading with them, for the sake of democracy, please don't come here with litigation. We want to have peace. That statement was a public acknowledgement that his previous platform, the ADC, was destabilized deliberately. The pattern is documented. The Labour Party before that, the ADC after that, now the NDC. But here is the complication that Udenta's intervention must navigate. Not all of the crisis inside the NDC is externally induced. Some of it is simply the natural friction of too many heavyweight politicians arriving in the same small house at the same time, with each of their own bases, their own expectations, and their own calculations about what comes after 2027. Consider Kwankwaso. His Kwankwasia movement commands genuine disciplined loyalty in Kano State and parts of the Northwest. That loyalty was the primary asset he brought to the ticket. But that same movement has its own internal logic. For Kwankwaso's people, joining the NDC is not an ideological conversion, it is a tactical alliance. They expect returns. They expected the Kano structure. When they felt that expectation was being negotiated away, the response was immediate, a threat to leave the party entirely. Now consider what it means for Peter Obi if Kwankwaso exits. In the 2023 election, Obi's single biggest deficit was Northwest votes. He was strong in the Southeast and Lagos. He had significant youth support across the South and parts of the Middle Belt, but the Northwest, with its enormous voter population, barely moved for him. Kwankwaso on the ticket is the structural answer to that deficit. Without him, the Obi NDC ticket loses its most credible argument for national reach. And that is precisely why Udenta's statement, made in this specific moment, is a strategic act, not just an expression of confidence. It is designed to reinforce the coalition's durability for the public, even as that coalition is privately under stress. There is a second strategic dimension worth naming. The Labour Party, in a statement issued on the 8th of June 2026, warned the NDC not to hand its entire elective structure over to Obi and his supporters. The LB statement invoked history. It accused the obedient movement of having entered the LB, captured its positions, and then turned those resources against the party leadership. Whether or not that account is accurate, the fact that it was said publicly means it is now part of the political narrative the NDC has to manage. Seriake Dickson addressed it directly. He blamed some of Obi's supporters, not Obi himself, for disparaging the NDC as a platform while claiming to support the presidential candidate. It was a careful diplomatic move, separating the candidate from his most zealous base, protecting the institutional relationship between the NDC's founding structure and its new arrivals. That balance between absorbing Obi's movement and not being consumed by it is the central strategic challenge of the next 12 months. We said we would come back to a specific name. We will. But first, you need to understand what is actually at stake for Nigerian democracy if this coalition collapses, because it is not just Peter Obi's political career, it is something much larger. Pull back further. What does the condition of the NDC mean for Nigeria? Nigeria's democratic architecture has a structural vulnerability that has been present since 1999 and has never been resolved. The opposition has never been able to sustain an institutionalized, organized alternative to whichever party controls the presidency. The PDP dominated for 16 years, the APC replaced it in 2015, but did so on the back of a merger, not an ideological shift. And the PDP, which should have been the opposition, spent most of those years in internal war. The NDC represents, at least in theory, a different possibility. It emerged not from a merger of political parties, but from a deliberate effort to build a platform around a candidate and a coalition, Obi-Kwankwaso, Dickson, who bring genuinely different regional bases. If it works, it changes the arithmetic of Nigerian presidential politics. If it does not work, the consequences go beyond 2027. A second failed Obi campaign, following 2023 and the fragmentation of the Labour Party, would raise serious questions about whether the reform-oriented electorate that galvanized around the obedient movement in 2023 can ever be channeled into durable institutional power. That electorate is predominantly young. Young Nigerian voters who have twice watched their preferred candidate fail to convert civic energy into electoral victory will not remain politically engaged indefinitely. Disengagement is the long-term risk. There is also the federal-state balance to consider. The NDC's primary crisis is in part a crisis of decentralization. The party's internal disputes are happening at the state level, Lagos, Kano, Abia, the Southeast broadly, and the national leadership does not fully control those outcomes. That mirrors almost precisely the fault line of Nigerian federal governance itself. A party that cannot govern its own primaries will find it difficult to make the case that it can govern Nigeria. On the economy, investor sentiment about Nigeria's political risk is not yet materially affected by NDC's internal difficulties, but the trajectory of the 2027 race matters to foreign capital. A credible, consolidated opposition compels the incumbent government to prioritize economic performance as a re-election asset. A fragmented opposition removes that pressure. The man on the street in Kano, in Aba, in Ibadan, the person earning below the poverty line, benefits from a government under competitive electoral pressure. They lose when the opposition implodes. Here is the uncomfortable historical fact. In every Nigerian presidential election since 1999, the candidate who won did not win because he was the best candidate. He won because the opposition was more divided than he was. That pattern holds until one thing changes. What is that one thing? Let us keep moving. The international community is watching the NDC's emergence with measured attention. Nigeria's democratic health matters beyond its borders. As Africa's largest economy and most populous nation, Nigeria's electoral integrity is a signal to the continent. The 2023 election attracted significant international observation. The controversy over its results, which Obi contested in court, was noted by international democracy monitors. The question of whether Nigeria's electoral process can be trusted is not merely a domestic argument. For the diaspora, and there are millions of Nigerians in the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and South Africa who followed the 2023 election with extraordinary intensity, the NDC's current condition is a direct test of whether the energy that produced the obedient wave has matured into something structurally sustainable. Many in the diaspora donated, canvassed, organized, and mobilized in 2023. They watched the post-election legal battle with frustration. What they are watching now is whether the coalition that they believed in can hold itself together without the emotional peak of an election. The NDC will also need to navigate the international question of political financing. Opposition parties in Nigeria face structural disadvantages in accessing funding relative to the party of the incumbent government. As the 2027 campaign intensifies, the ability of the NDC to resource its operations across 36 states, particularly in the north, will be directly tested. That is not a question Udenta's statement resolves, but it is the question that quietly underlies every optimistic projection about an Obi presidency.
Let us stillman the opposing view before we challenge it. The strongest argument made by those who are skeptical of Peter Obi's 2027 prospects is this. Obi has now contested a presidential election once, in 2023, with enormous momentum, a historic youth movement behind him, and the benefit of running against two deeply unpopular alternatives. And he still came third. The argument continues. What has changed structurally? The NDC is newer and less institutionally rooted than the Labour Party was in 2023. The incumbent now has the full resources of the federal government, and the crisis following the NDC's very first nationwide primary suggests that the coalition is already fracturing before a single campaign rally has been held. That is not a weak argument. It is one that Peter Obi's supporters need to take seriously rather than dismiss as APC propaganda. But here's the challenge to it. The 2023 result was not simply a reflection of Obi's failure. It reflected a divided opposition, a disputed process, and an electoral system that Obi himself alleged was designed to exclude him. He received over 6 million votes without a single incumbent-level resource advantage. The Obedient movement demonstrated that a new coalition of voters, cross-ethnic, cross-regional, predominantly young, could be mobilized around a values-based candidacy. That has never happened at that scale before in Nigerian political history. The NDC's post-primary turbulence is real, but compare it to the APC, which has been in federal power since 2015 and still experienced primary crises in its own states. Compare it to the ADC. Compare it to the PDP. Internal primary conflict is not unique to the NDC. What is unique is the speed at which the NDC's leadership, Dickson, Obi, and yes, Udenta, is publicly engaging those conflicts rather than pretending they do not exist. The June 12th closed-door meeting between Dickson and Obi, which lasted 3 hours and produced a public unity statement, is the kind of institutional response that the 2023 Labour Party never managed. The most common misconception circulating right now on social media is that the NDC is finished or collapsing. That is an overreading of what is at this stage a post-primary management challenge. Parties do not collapse because of primary disputes. They collapse when their leadership refuses to confront those disputes. The NDC's leadership is confronting them, imperfectly, under time pressure, but publicly and directly. Now, that name we said we would return to. In a statement published in June 2026 and shared with media, political analysts named several prominent Southeast NDC figures, including Professor Udenta, Senator Sam Egu, and others, as individuals who allegedly played roles in what some Obi supporters described as maneuvers that worked against the interests of the Obedient movement in the Southeast primaries. The specific allegation was that certain aspirants were sidelined, including the son of the late Senator Obi-Kwankwaso, a long-standing ally of Peter Obi. Now, Obi's legal team has moved to challenge those allegations in court, describing them as false and defamatory. And we must be very clear, these are allegations, not established facts. No court has found any of these named individuals culpable of anything. But here's why it matters analytically. When figures who are publicly associated with defending the coalition are simultaneously alleged by members of that same coalition to have acted against it internally, you have a credibility problem that no press statement can simply dissolve. The NDC's reconciliation process will have to address these specific grievances in the Southeast explicitly and verifiably. Vague calls for unity are not enough when the names of leaders are being attached to specific accusations. This is the space between the public declaration of confidence Peter Obi will be the next president and the internal political reality that still needs to be resolved. The most dangerous opponent of any coalition is not the ruling party. It is the quiet assumption inside the coalition itself that someone else on the same side is working a different agenda. Once that assumption takes root, no amount of public solidarity can kill it. What are the three most likely next moves, and what should you be watching? First, the INEC candidate upload deadline of June 26th. This is the single most consequential near-term event. If the NDC successfully uploads a clean, agreed list of candidates for all elective positions across all 36 states by that deadline, the post-primary disputes will be substantially contained. If the list is contested, if parallel lists are submitted, or if Kwankwaso's faction and the legacy NDC structure cannot agree on the Kano candidates, then the crisis deepens. Watch this date with precision. Second, Kwankwaso's next statement. The NNPP has already publicly claimed in a statement issued this month that Kwankwaso has not fully severed his ties to that party. The NDC needs Kwankwaso's Kano base. Kwankwaso needs a viable presidential ticket. But if the gap between those mutual needs cannot be bridged on the candidate list question, Kwankwaso's threat to exit becomes a real possibility. Watch not just what he says, but what his Kano lieutenants say in the 2 weeks following the June 26th deadline. Third, whether litigation reaches the NDC's registration. This is the scenario that Rufai Oseni identified early. Legal challenges to the NDC's very right to exist as a registered party have been anticipated. The party rushed its registration process, its national convention, and its primaries in rapid succession. Any procedural deficiency in that sequence can be exploited in court. Watch for filings at the Federal Court of Iron against the NDC's registration or against the validity of its primary results. That is the escalation scenario, and that is exactly what happened to the Labour Party and then the ADC before it. Under what conditions does this de-escalate? If the June 26th deadline is met cleanly, if the Kano dispute is resolved within the 60-40 framework that was originally agreed, and if Dickson's reconciliation process produces verifiable outcomes in the Southeast, not just press releases, then the NDC has a functional campaign window ahead of it. Over 12 months, if the coalition holds, Obi-Kwankwaso represents the most structurally diverse opposition ticket Nigeria has seen since the 2015 APC merger that brought Buhari and Osinbajo together. That ticket, if it campaigns cohesively, will force a genuine three-way race. Tinubu will not be able to treat 2027 as a walkover. Over 3 years, if the NDC fractures, the 2027 election reverts to a pattern Nigeria knows well: a dominant incumbent, a fragmented opposition, and a result that reflects organization rather than mandate. We began with a question: can a party tearing itself apart actually put Peter Obi in Aso Rock? Here's the honest answer: not in that condition, not yet. What Professor Udenta said is correct as a statement of ambition and as a statement of strategic intent. What it is not and cannot be at this stage is a statement of fact. The conditions for a Peter Obi presidency in 2027 are theoretically present. The national appetite for change is documented. The candidate's public credibility is established. The coalition on paper has geographic reach, but a coalition on paper and a coalition in the field are two different things. The NDC has a narrow window between now and the end of June to demonstrate that its post-primary turbulence is a manageable growing pain or not a structural collapse. How it handles the Kano dispute, the Southeast grievances, and the INEC candidate submission will tell us more about its electoral viability than any press conference or convention speech. Peter Obi himself, speaking to NDC members after the primary, said, "Let us not be occupied with the disappointment of today, let us look at tomorrow." That is not just a consolation, that is a strategic instruction, and the question is whether the people around him are actually listening. Push back on this analysis. Tell me in the comments what I have missed, what I have gotten wrong, and what you think the NDC's next move should be. I want to read your read on this. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.